So this session is actually about discerning fact, if there is such a thing. We're trying to get to understanding how do we go through and identify elements of potentially improper news, fake news, misinformation. I'm going to start by introducing Beth Lambert, who has agreed to facilitate this discussion. Beth is the head of policy and strategic accounts at Logically.AI. She's the former chair, committee of experts on the integrity of online information with the Council of Europe, and also served as the former head of counter disinformation in the UK Department for Culture, Media, and Sport. Thank you, Beth.
Really illustrate this challenge we're facing of how fast technology has been moving over the last 2 years. I wanted to tell you a story about when 2.5 years ago, I was the head of counter disinformation in UK government, and I was amazed to hear something that now seems so quaint in terms of the technology. And that was that you could literally track the day in a life of a Russian troll farm. So you could look at the outputs that the Kremlin had. They would start at 9 a.m., they'd be trying to hit their outputs. You could see these narratives spreading across social media. You could see it then pause, between 12:30 and 1:30. The Kremlin took a lunch break. They were a bit sleepy after lunch, so the outputs weren't as good. And then between 4 and 5, it would just rocket, and you could see this spike because they had to hit their targets before they were allowed to go home. And I remember being so surprised by this. And now looking back, I think, wow, that is old-fashioned to think that the Kremlin could take a lunch break. This is something that we can just see, really increasing with the current technology. As Alan said, I'm now the head of policy and strategic accounts at Logically, and we work with some of the biggest social media platforms, some of the biggest democratic governments to address disinformation through AI, fact-checking, and open-source intelligence. And it's clear to me from my conversations with members of the entire counter-disinformation community that the way that current and emerging technologies is impacting the spread of disinformation through hostile actors can really be categorized in 4 ways. And I try to remember this through A, B, C, D. So actor, behavior, content, and then domain. So on the actor side, we can see just this real increase in actors. We've spoken a lot today about the impact of the financial incentives on disinformation and just this increase in propagandists for hire because of the commercial advantage they will have in sharing this. Next, in behavior, we'll see through generative AI an increase not just in the current tactics that they use, so impersonation, amplification, and hack and leaks, but also new and quite novel tactics as well. And then on the content side, I tried to put myself in the shoes of a hostile state actor and has gone on to ChatGPT to see how many narratives it might pump out for me to then put on social media. And actually, a lot of them, you did get the guardrail pop-up that said, we can't comply with this request, this is against our terms of service, but quite a lot of other ones did go through. And actually, you can have a look, a little plug, if you've got one of these flyers on your table. You can see, logically, we've published an investigation today about election AI disinformation and how actually 86% of the images that we tried to create using Midjourney and DALL-E 2 did actually come up and bring through some disinformation in really hyper-realistic images about electoral disinformation as well. I think what's also quite alarming about the increase in content here is where I got pop-ups, where it said, because I put my request in English, and it said, we won't comply with your request to churn out this, harmful narrative about Ukraine. If I'd have put that in Arabic or maybe in Chinese, it would be much more likely to actually be able to be spread. So there's a huge multilingual issue there. And then finally, on the domain side, and his kind of colleagues, kind of friends in the audience who work for the BBC, that's a common one where we see all the time this blurring between where there's actually credible news organizations and then where AI has created a fake domain for the BBC, or indeed even ChatGPT itself, where they then spread malware and phishing scams on that website. So I think now looking back at this current landscape for new technologies, it does feel old-fashioned to think that how much this has changed in the last 2 years from back then, just 2.5 years ago. And I think what I'm really keen to get into with this panel is what do we do about this? And what was clear to me from my conversations in the Council of Europe when I was chairing that group, working across industry, academia, is that there is no one single way of solving this. You have to look at human-in-the-loop AI alongside these real kind of ethical, independent, the tenets that underpin fact-checking as well. But there's so much we can learn from other communities. So I'm really excited to introduce our panel today to get into the kind of scale of the issue we're facing, but also how we can tackle these and learn from each other's work as well. So first we have Andy Dudfield, the head of AI and interim chief executive at Full Fact. We have Craig Lewis, the Madison S. Wiggington Professor of Finance at Vanderbilt. We've got Caroline Scarton, the Senior Lecturer in Natural Language Processing at the University of Sheffield. And we've got Christabel Cowling, the EY Audit Partner and Head of Regulatory and Public Policy. So a huge thank you if you can just raise your hands for our panel today. So we'll do some kind of quick-fire questions that I've prepped with the panel in advance before we'll do some Q&A at the end. But Andy, if I could turn to you first, just to really set the scene, really, before we get into the opportunities and threats here. What are the main disinformation narratives, threats that your team are seeing at Full Fact at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. Wow, I can tell this room is amazing, but from the stage it looks even more ridiculous. It's absolutely incredible from up here. I've been really excited to listen to some of the conversations this morning, and there's been multiple references to fact checkers and indeed to Full Fact. So thank you everybody for your recognition of that. And this is what a fact checker looks like, which is kind of tired and stressed most of the time. And I just wanted to talk you through a little bit about what the world looks like. So for those who don't know, Full Fact's a fact checker based in the UK. We're a team of about 45 people, and we're here to address bad information. And I think the first thing that we see is scale. Full Fact's been going for about 14 years, and we've moved from a world of fact-checking wasn't quite the front page of newspapers, but it was relatively easy to identify the kind of narratives we might be working to a huge disparate collection of things. We'll go on to this a little bit later in the conversation, but we use some AI models to help us identify what we should be fact-checking each day. And there's roughly 100,000 statements each day that we identify that we might want to fact-check. And when you have a team of 12 fact-checkers, that's a pretty daunting thing that you're looking to engage with. The other thing that potentially we see is that the range of actors, the range of outlets has just spread so hugely. So the number of people we need to engage with in terms of identifying what kind of stories they're telling and where they're coming from. It is not the mainstream media, although sometimes it is that. It's politicians, and sometimes it's not politicians, and it's the fringes of the internet, and we can see a kind of journeys of misinformation as they go towards the mainstream. And then potentially the final thing we see is perhaps a lack of standards. I think it's really important to think about what good information looks like, and a lot of our work is around politicians. And this year we've asked 41 different politicians in the UK to correct themselves after we believe that they misspoke or made a mistake. And I think as I stand at the moment, 7 of them have corrected themselves. And that is problematic because correcting mistakes is not a sign of weakness, but it's a sign of good quality. We want to make sure that people believe and trust in people of power, because that's how democracy works. And I think certainly across what we're looking at here, there are elections coming down the line for so many people, and this next round of elections is going to be so hugely profound for some of the topics that we're talking about today. And yeah, I think this couldn't come at a more opportune time.
Thanks, Andy. I think on the topic of elections, I mean, over the last 15 years, it feels like we've had the Facebook election, the Twitter election, probably the last one will be the TikTok election. Now, looking ahead, 2024, a huge number of them seems to be the AI election. What predictions do you have for the impact of AI on the spread of this harmful online content during democratic events?
It's the question that keeps me up at night. I mean, I think my first prediction is I'm going to roll my eyes so hard every time when someone mentions an AI election. But apart from that, I think there's a lot to think through here. And I think the first thing that I want to, I think is important to call out is that AI could have a profoundly positive implication for the next round of elections. AI tools and the fact that the democratizing of the ability to create amazing imagery and high-quality video content could be a really powerful thing. The idea that people can tell really interesting stories and there's a lower barrier to entry of the creation of really creative things is a positive. And we've got to make sure that we don't risk demonizing the concept of generative AI, because there are definitely ways that it can be used with negative impacts, but there are positives as well. I want to make sure we start with that. But I think the challenges, if we want to move to those, are effectively we're in a world where we have got a wide collection of plausibility machines being created. So the generative AI approach of saying, okay, we can create really plausible looking images or video or text is challenging in terms of we don't quite know what that's going to look like, but there's definitely an element of being able to flood a system. Large volumes of information that look plausible will have an impact on our ability to highlight the good information and to cut through and make sure that the right voices can be heard. And I think that's going to be challenging because the tools, the media literacy that we have to ask people to think about how does this make you feel, but are you checking for references? Can you see a citation? Is it from a brand that you trust? In a world where generative AI can create things that look plausible but are entirely made up, there's a real challenge in the way that we ask people to navigate that. So I think that's going to be a big impact of our world. There's definitely something in the world of actors as well, in terms of the kind of tools that we have are very democratized. We've moved from AI being a research practice to most people in this room have probably got some cool app on your phone that can make some fun thing. And so we're not really sure about whether we're dealing with bored teenagers or nation states. So there's that range of people who could be creating a challenge is really difficult. And I think that foundationally, we lack a shared terminology. So we're currently talking about things like AI models hallucinating. And I feel like that's kind of problematic in trying to make sure that people understand what we're dealing with here. This idea of trying to make things seem more humane seems kind of slightly problematic. And also that we're dealing with just an entirely new paradigm for the way that people are going to be interacting with things. And we don't have a great set of skills. I think potentially online we're still at the point of trying to tell our parents not to buy stuff online unless they can see a padlock in a browser. Now we're in a world where we're trying to explain much more complex and nuanced things that are foundationally as a medium different to what we've experienced before. And I think finally, I would say that one of the things we need to consider is, because of those challenges, what is our shared protocol that we want to use in elections? If we're worried about this, but we don't know quite what this is going to look like, what is our process to say electoral integrity has been compromised? And I think one of the things I always point to here is that in Canada, they have exactly that. They have the election integrity protocol, so that there are a group of people who have been ordained and are in place to say, look, we believe something has compromised this election. And I think that's really powerful, because the last thing we want to do is to start ad hoc making choices in an election cycle, because I think there'll be some really dangerous consequences to that.
Thanks, Andy. I think on the point there on election integrity, I think if you'd have sat me down, 2.5 years ago when I was surprised at the idea of the Kremlin taking a lunch break, I think I would have said, what you have if you're a hostile actor is a choice between scale and like the quantity of output that you would have during an election, or you can choose quality. And there's a trade-off for both of them. So with the 2016 elections, a huge amount of disinformation through bots. But as soon as you look at the handle of a random series of numbers and a username, you could pretty much work out that it wasn't going to be authentic. And then you also saw in different, more recent elections we've had in the UK, very sophisticated, personalized, tailored accounts, which have been created with whole personalities around them. They'll have football teams and cats, and the hostile states have spent hours crafting these personas. And now with the kind of AI that you mentioned, it's so much easier to have these sophisticated, quite mature influence campaigns in a way that they don't have to choose anymore between quality and quantity. It's just been leveled up across each of them. So I wonder, that sounds very doom and gloom, Andy. So I wonder if you could talk us through how do we then use different tools, different types of AI in your fact-checking work to try and get ahead of that kind of cat and mouse game of threat creation, threat detection?
Yeah. Great points as well, and also I feel like I always need to keep to say I'm an optimist. I'm always an optimist in this world, although at times it is hard to maintain that. Full Fact has invested in technology for quite a long time, because we want to ensure that we can be as efficient as we possibly can be. And efficiency in our world is about making sure that our fact checkers can be work as fast as they can and as smart as they can. And so we use AI in quite a lot of different ways, but our AI is always used to empower a fact checker. I think the idea of trying to use artificial intelligence to replicate or replace anybody who's trying to do the nuance and the complexity of fact checking is a very terrifying space. But what we do is we are institutionally, we are fact checkers, and so we're able to build technology that solves the problems that we're facing. And there's two that I just want to highlight briefly here. First is to identify what to fact check each day. That's a hugely problematic area. So saying there's 100,000 things in the UK, we work with organizations around the world who are facing similar scales. And so AI is very good at helping to sort information. That's one of its superpowers. And so we use artificial intelligence to neatly stack up information and say to our fact checkers, this looks like an important thing to check. You can pick from a short list or you can pick something else, but here is a synthesis of all the information. That's really powerful. We also use it to try and make sure that we work as quickly as we can. So that's in the place of, can we try and identify the official statistics that have been suggested in a claim that we're checking? Is it unemployment is going up, down, things about the macroeconomics? They're relatively easy to sort of procedurally say, we can just get that information and quickly work it out. And then the third thing that we do is we try and identify where people repeat things we've already fact-checked. There are about 150,000 fact checks ever written. That's an amazing number, very proud of that, but also in relation to the web, that is an absolutely terrifyingly small number. And so every fact check that we write, we want to make sure that we can apply it time and again. And AI is also really powerful at that it can identify where someone has said something that maybe uses completely different words, but means the same thing as something we've previously fact-checked. And that ability to apply fact checks multiple times means that we can get so much more, and we find thousands of repeats of where people have repeated things we previously checked. That AI is really smart in helping to identify, again, to a human in a loop who can make that choice. And that kind of technology, which we're really lucky to have in full fact, we're working with partners around the world. This chair was meant to be taken by an amazing man called Lee Muiti from Africa Check, who is going to be talking about some of the work that we've done with an amazing fact-checking organization based in Nigeria, South Africa, and Senegal. And that's using, again, the kind of shared technologies that we have available, and we want more people to be able to use it. So I'm the guy in the bright yellow t-shirt, but if you ever want to chat about AI and fact-checking after this, I'm more than happy to do so. And I think that's probably enough from me. I feel like I've spoken for ages.
Thanks, Andy. I think, Carol, I'd love to turn to you now in this context about AI. You're someone who's been working on this for so many years before the explosion of headlines, end of last year about ChatGPT. What's your reflections on whether this impact we've talked about on AI, on disinformation, has it been overstated? What do you think based on your work?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's amazing to be here. I think it's important to say that my background is computer science, so whatever I say is from this technical background. Personally, I don't think we have been overstating the impact of AI on disinformation. What we may be doing, though, is looking at it on the wrong angle. So we may be thinking that AI, like Skynet, is going to come and create the disinformation and so on. I think the malicious actors are probably using AI in the same way that full fact and other fact checkers are using AI. So, for example, we saw many research that said that a lot of networks of disinformation mimicking news websites that were disseminated in multiple languages used machine translation. So machine translation is a tool that's there for many, many years, and it is an AI-based tool, and people are using it for disinformation. So I think what we need to do instead is start looking into those real uses of AI that can be also addressed by malicious actors, and even things that are simpler and more embedded on our lives. So, for example, when people query web searches like Google, this is geolocated. So the kind of answer that you get in the UK is different from the answer that you get in the US, is different from the answer that you get in other parts of the world. So people are seeing different sides of the same argument or different sides of the truth. So that, for me, personally, is a bit more problematic in the sense that AI is being misused. I also think that we are still to see the real impact of large language models on AI. I try to be more optimistic, like Andy. I do think that there is a lot that we can do with it. We are seeing a breakthrough in technology. This is very exciting from a technical perspective and from, I think, everybody's perspective. However, we still need to do more research. We still need to see what's going to happen. It is probably the first time that an AI can produce something very logical without much intervention. So that may speed up the way that people produce disinformation, but on the other hand, may speed up the way that we also do the debunk.
Thanks, Carol. And I think we heard from the session just before then about the role of regulation in this space with mainly social media platforms. But what guardrails do you recommend that generative AI companies can put in place to try and stop some of this use by bad actors?
Ooh, that's a very difficult question, and I don't think there is a simple answer. I do think that, as I think you mentioned on the beginning, there are some guardrails already in place. So whenever you prompt large language models like ChatGPT, you may already received some answers that are more or less tailored because they already know that that's a sensitive topic, that's a problematic topic. However, I believe that the best way of achieving really an AI that you can trust is through a very diverse team. You need to involve not only computer scientists, but you need to involve people from ethics, you need to involve people from law, you need to involve social scientists. That's the only way that you can understand how this kind of technology can impact society and can have potential harmful impact. So, for example, yesterday I was just playing with ChatGPT before this panel, and I started asking some questions about vaccines and so on. And from my perspective, yesterday, before the session this morning, I was like, okay, that's very good. It is saying, no, it's all false, and this has already been debunked and so on. But then on the panel this morning, we saw that perhaps that's not the correct approach when someone is already adoctrinated to believe on a given narrative. So, if you work with different people, you potentially improve the tool to address the answer on a more subtle way that is not so aggressive, saying, oh, this is completely wrong. So I think the other thing that is also related to what Stephen said earlier today, there is a lot of hype around this kind of models, and you need to be really careful because hype is something that can cause a lot of harm. So I think that whoever is selling these models or whoever is developing the models needs to be really real about its capabilities, its limitations, and the potential harms.
I think on what you mentioned there about the hype, there's been so much conversation online, first 6 months of the year about new work in this space, some really exciting breakthroughs. I know at Logically we've been working on an AI model on coordinated inauthentic behavior. So meaning, coordinated accounts with a really unified goal, a very specific amount of time, inauthentic because it's very clear, we've got previous models on bot detection that doesn't really work with kind of normal patterns of human life. They're posting at kind of random hours, and then the behaviors that we see spread. So trying to move away from these kind of micro AI models of detection to more ones that you can see overarching narratives, patterns of behavior. And I feel like as a community, we've got so many exciting stories like this. I wonder if I could ask you, reading the tea leaves, where do you see next 6 months of this year? What new breakthroughs can we expect and look forward to?
I think it's historically, let's say, it's difficult to predict. I personally, I wasn't expecting ChatGPT to come up so quickly and become the massive hype it had become, but I may be a naive person. I do think that we are going to see some new or some quite powerful tools coming up. So for example, the multimodal large language models, whenever they roll out for more people or for, let's say, large scale, that's going to be quite impactful. So it's not only text now, but it's images, it is videos, it is audio, so there is a lot going on. I think as well, with the kind of models that we have at the moment, we can get quite logical answers or something that looks like or may make sense, but there is no reasoning, right? So perhaps whenever we start to actually create some kind of context reasoning or being able to actually establish a dialogue where there is some attention to what was said before, so those kind of tools may actually cause the next breakthrough, in my opinion.
Thanks, Carol. And I think, Craig, you're someone with a huge amount of expertise on these types of tools. What advice do you have for people who are either looking to develop or draw from current technology to speed up that process of identifying, disclosing false information?
Great. Thanks. So a little bit of background. I'm not only a professor, but there was a period where I worked at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission as their chief economist. And I ran the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis, and part of our mandate was, I thought, risk assessment and building risk assessment tools. That was actually the reason I took the job, is the SEC did not previously do any of that work, right? And so I thought that the big contribution I might be able to have in a regulatory space would be to actually build tools that would assist actors in the commission, the Division of Corporation Finance and Enforcement primarily. And so if you think about it, I'm going to put this in the context of accounting fraud, maybe just to give you an example, an anecdote of how I thought about building out a model and some of the problems I encountered, going through that process. And so the anecdote I had was, I view accounting fraud as a type of disinformation, right? You're basically trying to represent your financial position in a way that is inconsistent with the actual performance that the company experienced. And so the question I had is, there's been a lot of work in financial accounting looking at earnings management, and could I try to think about some of those same concepts, right? And so the way I started out was I developed what I thought was a prototype model. Right? Can I identify firms? And one of the great things about working at a regulator is you actually happen to know who was accused and convicted of accounting fraud. So you actually have a sample of firms, and you know the behavior of those firms, and you can be informed by past accounting fraud actions to help inform how you want to look for other accounting fraud, firms that might have committed accounting fraud. And so I started with that, and I felt if I wanted any traction in the commission for these types of ideas, I needed a prototype, and I needed to be able to demonstrate that it does a reasonably good job of identifying the firms that actually I knew had committed accounting fraud in the past, right? And so I knew who I was after, and I had to deliver at some level that my model was going to identify these people. So I built out the prototype and was able to demonstrate that it could do a pretty good job, actually, of identifying firms that tended to over-report income. And so I decided that we would build this tool out. And I had to think, so when you're building a tool like that, there's a couple of key things I thought were important. The one, who are my users? Who is going to be using the tool itself? What expertise did they actually have? Could they understand a model? And at the commission, I was dealing with attorneys, and that was my primary audience. And not to insult any of the attorneys in the room, but as a general rule, they're not very quantitatively oriented, right? The reason they went to law school is they didn't like math, but they were good analytically. And so having taught in law school, I think I can say that a little bit. But anyway, so I knew that it had to be something that resonated with the attorneys. And the other group that I had to really address were the CPAs and the accountants in the commission who were responsible for reviewing the filings. And so I tried to understand. So I went out and I tried to present some results. We had a kind of a tool that we developed internally that would produce reports on demand and provide, and I thought, this is great. Wouldn't you just love to have this? And I realized they didn't really want it. You know, the fact that I thought it was a great tool meant that the people that had to use it didn't think it was such a great tool. And part of the reason, I think initially, is it wasn't delivering the kind of information they needed to actually conduct their reviews. And so after we trotted it out and we went through and we talked to my customers, I realized they were much more comfortable with Excel spreadsheets. And so instead of delivering fancy PDF documents that were generated on demand, that had great graphical, features and neat graphs, they just wanted the data in a spreadsheet form. So literally, we went back and said, what is it you want? What kind of information do you use in your reviews? And I found that if I could deliver that type of information, they would be much more inclined to use it. And if you're a financial regulator, one of the things that I've discovered when I worked with regulators is they don't manage risk, they avoid risk. This is the most risk-averse crew you're ever going to encounter. And so they viewed this tool that I thought would be very helpful to them as an audit tool. That if my model said this firm is likely to have committed accounting fraud, if they go through the statements and they don't find any evidence of that, and it subsequently turns out that, yeah, this was a fraud firm, they're afraid of the blowback. It's going to come back to them. And so I had a really hard time convincing my primary audience that this was a great tool. And what really broke the ice for the tool was understanding I had a second audience, which were the attorneys, the enforcement attorneys. They only had to get at a fraudster. They didn't care about how many they missed. If the tool could find one good, successful enforcement action, that was a victory to them. And so I was able to really push the tool forward, much to the dismay, really, of the folks in the Division of Corporation Finance, because the Division of Enforcement adopted the tool and was using it and was trying to go out and find, and they were successfully able to identify a number of fraud cases that way. And once it became clear that enforcement was using it, the folks in corporation finance almost had to adopt it, right? So they were sort of forced to accept the tool. But so I thought the big lesson I learned there was understand who you're actually selling the tool to. Make sure they understand. So one of the things that we tried to do when we developed the model is we made sure that the outputs of the model were things they could immediately use as a part of their examination. I know that in this space, like the PCAOB had a model. That's the accounting regulator, the accountants regulator in the US. And they had a model for doing this, but it was this black box, and it was almost, the factors that were coming out of the model were almost, if the mean temperature in New York is 10 degrees higher during the month of August, you might actually have an accounting fraud. And it was completely useless. It may have actually identified fraud, but the people that were doing it couldn't tell you why the fraud existed. So I thought maybe the best thing to do would be to actually say, hey, these are things in the financial statement you could actually look at. And so as we developed this model out, I thought the output has to be actionable. It has to be verifiable. And most importantly, I felt there had to be transparency around the model. And I felt that there was sort of a public deterrence aspect to this, right? So I wanted the public to know, filers to know, that this could be a tool that was used. And so when I first started making presentations about the model, a lot of people in the audience would ask, well, are you going to reveal the tool? What are the factors? And my initial thought was, no, I'm not going to do that because I want to have the tool be able to find the bad actors. But then on reflection, I thought, you know something? We're in a lot better space if I just let you know what I'm looking for. And so transparency about what you're trying to detect and how you're going about detecting it struck me as actually socially optimal, because what it means is if there was an obvious way to cook your books, and I let firms know that we were examining that specifically, they're not going to do it anymore. And so what if I can take off a lot of obvious techniques off the table, it meant you had to use other ways to cook your books. And because you're finding other ways, they're obviously harder to implement, harder to execute, and easier to detect in the long run.
I think just picking up your point then on transparency, which is so important in this context, for I think regardless of the kind of part of the counter-disinformation community you're working on, I know Andy will know as well, there's been a huge amount of politicization, kind of attacks that are really worrying, leveled at the fact checkers, at academics as well. I wondered your reflections on how we can maintain our kind of credibility, reputation in this space as a community.
So it seems like a really complicated problem, right? Because you have basically vested interests, right? And as long as there's a conflict of interest in the message you're delivering, there will be people that try to leverage that view one way or the other. And so at the end of the day, I think the question is, are there known biases, right? And I think one of the things that we're seeing with ChatGPT is that if there are biases in the underlying corpus that's being used to develop the tool, they come right through in the types of output that the tool produces. So the question is, how do you deal with that? I think you have to do a better job grooming the initial corpus, right? And this is where Andy's fact-checking ideas come in. As long as what's being put in there are factual, you'll get better output. But it's also an adaptive tool, right? Because it takes your proprietary information and puts it right into the corpus. So whatever garbage you're putting in there eventually makes its way into the tool. And so as a user, I think it's really exciting. I think this type of technology is great. I've been surprised at how good it is in terms of doing specific tasks. It makes mistakes, but if you are using it in a productive, constructive way, you know how to filter the mistakes out, right? And so you know when there's a problem, but it can really streamline doing a lot of kind of mundane tasks. And so I haven't got to the point where I'm asking it to generate my exam questions yet, but I think my students are using it to answer my exam questions, which I don't know about the faculty in the room, but I had a problem with that, right? This past year, where I had an exam which was objective and I gave it online, right? It was multiple choice. And out of 140 students, I had 10 perfect scores. I had never had a perfect score on any exam I've ever given in the 37 years I've been at Vanderbilt. So for 10 people to get it on an electronic exam told me that they were using some sort of AI, right? So my solution.
Very widespread, exactly. I wonder, last but not least then, Christabel, from the perspective of the work you're doing, AI, I think brands can really underestimate the impact that disinformation can have on their bottom line. I wondered where you see are the best, the main disinformation threats on businesses and financial markets.
So, thanks. So Craig talked about businesses putting out disinformation. The other challenge for businesses suffering from disinformation. And we see it all over the place, in big ways in financial markets and in small ways. And businesses, simple things like if a business decides it's going to take them longer to put out their financial results, they put an announcement out. And the rumour mill and the information and the disinformation that is put out regularly about why that might be can lead to all sorts of things, 25% drop in share price in a day. And then when the results do come out, the results are as expected and there isn't anything suspicious in there. So that's one issue around disinformation straight to the financial markets. But it's really interesting because ultimately this is all about, and we've heard this again and again today, this is all about trust in business. And business needs to understand much more why people trust them, and that is changing. So it's not just the pounds and the financial information, but their customers, their employees and their investors want to understand much more what their impact, their social impact is, their impact on the world, their impact on the planet. And these things are becoming more and more critical. And so business needs to understand all of that and understand that being trusted over all of that is really important. And the more information that they need as a business to put out there, the more they need to think about what their story is around that and how they ensure that that information is sound and correct. And, you know, you just think about ESG reporting, how you go down the line and make sure what you're saying actually stacks up for the multiple players in your supply chain is really difficult. So businesses have real challenges now to maintain a level of trust, and they are being attacked in all different ways. And my experience is that most businesses are way behind the curve as to actually having assessed these risks and then putting in some kind of risk mitigation plan for them.
And within the context of audit, what kind of tools, AI models are you using to try and discern that correct information?
So we need, you know, I'm just going to preface this. We're not usually at the cutting edge of technology in the audit practice. You know, we've been fact checkers for a very long time, and some of that fact checking has been green pen ticking. But we have moved an awful long way forward. So, and it was interesting, I think it was what you were saying, Andy, was that some of the tools you're using aren't necessarily doing more, but they're doing things better, or they're doing things more efficiently. So we've started using AI for a number of things. One of the most interesting, I think, is actually where we get information and evidence, particularly from a third party, is actually using AI to work out if this is a real third party, even though it might look like it's come from X bank, has it actually come from that? Is what we have been given the original document? Has it been tinkered with? Is there a break in the chain somewhere that this means this isn't at what we think at face value it means? And we've seen that in very big frauds, those being some of the issues that have allowed fraud to happen in business. We're also using AI for really dull stuff like spreadsheet analysing. Every business, regardless of scale or size, will somewhere use spreadsheets for something really important that ends up in their financial statements. And these can be, you know, there's bound to be a mistake somewhere in these spreadsheets. There's something hard-coded that shouldn't be hard-coded. There's something where the formulas don't work. There's some bit of information dragged in that's not brought from the right thing. And we are using AI not just to do the checking of that, but actually to say, logically, does this work? Does this do what you think it actually works? And then for me as an audit partner, I don't know how many of you have picked up a set of glossy financial statements recently, but you know, there's usually 300 pages in there. I reckon I'm probably the only person who reads it from beginning to end. And it's not a joy of my job doing that. But within that 300 pages, there's a reference on this page to a number that's on this page that's then reported in the financial statements. And I have a responsibility for making sure that those numbers are right. I have a responsibility for making sure the page numbers are blinking right. So actually what we're doing is developing AI that actually can go in, not just into that document, but other documents, presentations and things, and actually say to us, this doesn't work, the logic here is not right, this looks wrong. And they really help because they provide a much better level of assurance than my offshore team doing it, or indeed my audit team sitting in a room at 10 o'clock at night trying to do it when they've been working really hard for days. So we are trying to kind of do different things and then do things we currently have to do better using AI.
I think that shows some really interesting lessons learned from us from audit to other parts of the counter-disinformation community. So it's just kind of one very quick final question. What would you see as the other kind of main takeaways that you could share with this room based on your audit background?
So it was really interesting. The last panel session here touched on some of these things. So there's things like standards, and there's things like transparency. But one of the things that is really important within the audit space, and I'm going to call that a fact-checking space, is actually independence, demonstrable independence when you're providing fact-checking. Because if you don't, you know, nothing makes people not trust what's coming out, then some view that that fact checker's in that person's pocket. And it has to be perceived and it has to be real as well. So standards, transparency, independence, that type of thing, I think is something that's been hard fought in the audit practice, and we've been challenged repeatedly on it. And we have to adjust and change. But they are the things that build trust most effectively.
I think, yeah, at that point on kind of trust, consistent principles is probably a good place to end this discussion before we turn to a bit of audience Q&A. If anyone's got any questions, please do raise your hand and we'll get the mics your way.
Thank you. I have a question for the auditor. What role do your staff play in monitoring social media, and how do you use that information? And for instance, let's say a short seller comes out and says Coca-Cola is managing the books. What role does the auditor play in helping to communicate information to investors?
Okay. So it's a really good question. We've been caught out as auditors repeatedly by not taking account of information that's coming out, short seller reports, that type of thing. And it's really important as auditors, you really try and understand what's driving a particular social media campaign. And that is a new element of an audit, if you like, because this information just wasn't there and available. So kind of linked to that, often now when we're thinking about taking on a business as an audit client, we will go and look at what is happening, short selling reports in social media, etc., around that business to help make our decisions around reputational risk too.
Sorry, just follow up. Are you you are monitoring social media for your clients?
No, not for our clients. No, we monitor social media as part of our risk assessment process. And then our risk assessment process will feed into kind of where we put our audit effort, etc. So, ultimately your question was, what do our staff do? Well, once we've set our risk, said where we need to focus our work, they'll then go and do that work.
Thank you.
We've got a question at the back.
Yeah, back in the cheap seats. Christabel, you said that AI can help with the accounting process. What effect might AI have had theoretically if, say, it was around during the era of Enron and WorldCom and things like that? Would those scandals have happened? And on that same note, Craig, regulations of the financial industry that SEC and Congress passed, things like Sarbanes-Oxley, is there any kind of equivalent that you could foresee that could be applied, say, to social media companies? Thank you.
My personal view is that the effective development of AI within the audit process will impact a company's ability to commit fraud, the type of things you're talking about. Are we there yet? No, we're not. And there is a long way of development to go. So I suspect, to answer your question, I'm saying I think it might have made it harder for those businesses, those issues to happen. But that isn't to say we're there yet, stopping it, preventing it either.
Right. So the question about what regulation analogs exist in the financial space that could be applied to social media companies. And one of the key features, I think, of Sarbanes-Oxley would be the requirement for there to be independence, right? A lot of independence requirements, not only board independence, but also separation, independence within an investment bank, where you separate the equity research analysts from the deal teams, right? Because there are huge conflicts of interest. And it seems like similar conflicts of interest exist in social media space, right? So you have, let's say your Twitter, your X, Elon Musk wants as many users as possible because that drives advertising dollars. So this idea that I want to be the free speech haven is really driven more about revenue than it is, not to put words in his mouth, but I'll I'll posit that it's more about revenue generation than it is about free speech. And so at the end of the day, there's a conflict there. So if you are going to be worried about content moderation, I think one of the ways you address that is you try to ask, what are you doing with content moderation? How do you create transparency around content moderation so that people understand what it is you're doing? So, one of the ideas that just popped in my head during one of the earlier panels was, it seems that if I'm posting and you want to deny my post, right? You want to disallow that post from being allowed to show up in the platform. It seems that could be something that would be more, at least initially, could be automated, right? Some type of transparent tool that could explain why your post was denied. So why was my post denied? What could I possibly do to post a similar idea that isn't so inflammatory or isn't so insulting or isn't personal? There should be ways of using transparent tools so that people understand why they are not being allowed to post, and you could have standards around building those tools, I think would be one way to possibly do it.
Thanks, Craig. Some really interesting questions there. I think we've got time for one more. I think we've got someone just over here at the back. In the middle there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Eliani Abdurrahman from Harvard University. My question is directed at Andy. With the growing political polarization and how has this affected your work, has your staff given you feedback about fear from getting harassment because of the work that they're doing? And if so, or perhaps you can just mention this for your own industry as opposed to specifically for your company. And if so, what do you do in order to mitigate against that, against the online harassment?
Sure. I think it's an inherent part of our world that people who are involved in fact-checking or involved in promoting good information are likely to receive pushback from people who believe that their beliefs have been challenged, and that is complex. From our point of view, very specifically in Full Fact, we have to bake that into our recruitment processes. We ask in our first and our second round interviews if people are aware of the consequences of that or aware that it's all happening. And we also think about how do we support our staff. And that's very difficult to know exactly what that's going to look like because the polarization of politics is increasing, but what those vectors of disruption can look like change over time. But I think fact checkers and anybody who's involved in this mis and disinformation space, we have a duty of care for our staff, and that's something that we take tremendously seriously.
Thanks, Andy. I think that's all we've got time for in terms of questions, but I think I can speak on behalf of the panel that we'll be around for coffee if anyone wants to come and ask us something in person. I know we began the session, Andy Carroll mentioned being optimists in this space. I feel from Christabel and Craig, we've got a bit of realism in there as well about scale of the challenge here. So maybe we can be realistic optimists going forward. But if everyone can just say a round of applause to our panel. Thanks so much.